She sits in the third pew from the back, exactly where she's sat every Sunday for the past 17 years. Her phone buzzes. It's a text from her best friend asking if she wants to get coffee after church. She types back, "I'm actually not going anymore." Send. Delete the entire conversation. Her grandmother sits 3 seats away singing a hymn written in 1876. The young woman mouths the words but doesn't sing. In 6 months, she'll never return to this building, and she's not alone. Across America between 2016 and 2023, the percentage of Gen Z adults who identify as Christian dropped from 75% to 54%. That's not a gradual decline, that's a mass exodus. Every single day, approximately 1,000 young people in the United States decide they're done with the church, not God necessarily, not spirituality, not even Jesus sometimes. But the institution, they're walking away and they're not looking back. But here's what makes this different from every other generational shift in religious history. They're talking about it, loudly, publicly, in YouTube videos with millions of views, in TikToks that go viral overnight, in podcasts that your pastor has probably never heard of but should be listening to. And what they're saying isn't just church is boring or I have better things to do on Sunday morning. What they're saying is far more brutal, far more specific, and far more damning than anything religious institutions have faced in modern American history. This is Professor Archive, and what you're about to hear might make you uncomfortable. It might make you defensive. It might make you sad. But if you care about the future of faith in America, you need to hear it. Before we go further, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing our global community come together on these videos. The statistics tell a story that church leaders can no longer ignore. According to the Pew Research Center's 2023 Religious Landscape Study, Gen Z, defined as those born between 1997 and 2012, is the least religious generation in American history. 34% identify as religiously unaffiliated, what researchers call knowns. For context, that number was just 16% for baby boomers at the same age. But numbers only tell part of the story. The real story is in the why, and that's where things get uncomfortable. In March 2021, a 23-year-old named Sarah posted a TikTok video titled, "Why I Left the Church." It wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic. She just sat in her car and spoke for 60 seconds. The video got 4.2 million views. The comment section became a confessional booth for thousands of young people sharing remarkably similar stories. Sarah's reason for leaving? "I watched my church raise $80,000 for a new sound system in 3 weeks. We'd been trying to raise money for the local homeless shelter for 2 years and got $3,000. That video spawned thousands of responses. Ex-evangelicals sharing their stories, ex-Catholics, ex-Mormons, ex-everything. And a pattern emerged. They weren't leaving because they discovered philosophy or science. They weren't leaving because they wanted to sleep in on Sundays. They were leaving because of what they experienced inside the church walls. A 2022 study by the Springtide Research Institute surveyed over 10,000 young people about their religious beliefs and practices. When asked why they left their religious communities, the top answer wasn't, "I stopped believing in God." It was, "I don't feel like I belong." The second most common answer, "The religious community is hypocritical." Third, "My religious tradition doesn't align with my values on social issues." Let's unpack that last one because it's where the conversation gets most heated. According to a 2023 survey by the Public Religion Research Institute, 73% of Gen Z believes that homosexuality should be accepted by society. Among white evangelical Christians over 65? 29%. That's not a generation gap. That's a canyon. 26-year-old Marcus grew up in a Baptist church in Texas. He played guitar in the worship band, led Bible study, went on mission trips to Central America. In 2019, his younger sister came out as gay. The church told his parents they needed to send her to conversion therapy or ask her to leave the congregation. Marcus's family chose their daughter. They all left together. The pastor said we were choosing sin over salvation, Marcus told an interviewer last year. I said we were choosing love over judgment. He said those were the same thing. Stories like Marcus's are everywhere. In online forums, in YouTube comment sections, in private Facebook groups with names like Recovering Evangelicals and Ex-Evangelical Support. These groups have tens of thousands of members and they're growing daily. But the issues go deeper than social politics. They cut to the core of what young people watch their churches become, especially during two pivotal periods: the Trump presidency and the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2016, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. That number actually increased to 84% in 2020. For many young people raised in these churches, this was a breaking point, not because of politics in the abstract, but because of the dissonance. They'd been taught that character matters, that integrity matters, that how you treat the least among us matters. And then they watched their pastors and parents enthusiastically support a candidate they felt embodied the opposite of everything they'd been taught Christianity stood for. A 28-year-old woman named Rachel wrote on Twitter in 2020, "My youth pastor told me I couldn't wear shorts to church because my brother's in Christ to stumble. But he put a Trump sign in the church parking lot. Explain that to me." The tweet got 67,000 likes. The replies were thousands of similar stories. Young people pointing out contradictions. The church that preached sexual purity celebrating a man married 3 times who bragged about grabbing women. The church that preached caring for immigrants supporting family separation at the border. The church that preached turning the other cheek celebrating aggressive, combative rhetoric. Whether you agree with these young people's political assessments or not, the point is this: they saw what they perceived as hypocrisy, and they walked. Then came COVID-19, and everything accelerated. During the pandemic, many churches became political battlegrounds over masks and vaccines. Young people watched their pastors preach conspiracy theories from the pulpit. They watched their churches refuse to close even as members got sick. They watched their youth leaders post on Facebook that COVID was a hoax while their grandmother was on a ventilator. A study by the Harvard Institute of Politics found that Gen Z's trust in religious institutions dropped by 18 percentage points between 2020 and 2022. That's the steepest decline for any institution measured, including government and media. But perhaps most damaging was what happened with online church. When everything went virtual, young people who'd been attending out of obligation, out of family pressure, out of habit, suddenly had an excuse to stop. And many of them realized something. They didn't miss it. The community they'd been promised, they had better community in their Discord servers and group chats. The spiritual growth they'd been seeking, they found it in books, podcasts, meditation apps. The sense of purpose, they found it in activism, in volunteering, in social movements. One young man, 24-year-old James, told a researcher, "During quarantine, I realized I'd been going to church because I was supposed to, not because I wanted to. When I stopped, I actually felt closer to God than I ever had sitting in a pew." And this is where we need to address something crucial. For many Gen Zers leaving the church, this isn't a story about losing faith. It's about relocating it. A 2022 Barna study found that while Gen Z is leaving religious institutions in record numbers, 65% still consider themselves spiritual. They pray. They believe in something beyond themselves. They seek meaning and transcendence. They're just not finding it in traditional church settings. Why? Because the church, they argue, stopped being about spirituality and became about politics, power, and preservation of the institution itself. 25-year-old Alicia, who left her Catholic church in 2021, put it this way: "I watched my church spend millions on legal fees to settle abuse cases while cutting funding for the food pantry. I watched priests protect predators and silence victims. I watched the institution choose itself over the people it was supposed to serve. That's not faith. That's corporate survival." And there it is, the issue that underlies almost every other: institutional failure. The Catholic abuse scandals. The Southern Baptist Convention's mishandling of sexual abuse allegations. The megachurch pastors with private jets, the financial scandals, the cover-ups, the gaslighting of victims. Gen Z came of age in the era of Nunexplort Me Too and Nunnesnard Church Too. They watched case after case of abuse and institutional protection of abusers. And unlike previous generations, they had the internet to connect with other survivors, to share stories, to realize they weren't alone. The Houston Chronicle's 2019 investigation found that over 700 victims of sexual abuse in Southern Baptist churches had come forward, and that was likely a vast undercount. The Pennsylvania grand jury report in 2018 identified over 300 predator priests and more than 1,000 victims in just 6 dioceses. These weren't isolated incidents. These were systemic failures. For young people watching this unfold, the question became, how can an institution claim moral authority when it systematically protected predators and silenced victims? 27-year-old David, who left his evangelical church in 2020, said, "They told us secular society was corrupt and immoral. Then I watched my worship leader get arrested for child pornography. I watched the elders try to keep it quiet. I watched them blame his wife. The corruption was coming from inside the house." But it's not just about scandal. It's about what young people see as the church's failure to address the issues they care most about: climate change, racial justice, economic inequality, mental health. According to a 2023 survey by the Institute for Religion and Democracy, 78% of Gen Z considers climate change a critical issue. Yet many conservative churches either deny climate science or consider it a low priority. Young people are being told that fighting climate change is less important than fighting against transgender rights or abortion access. For them, that's a moral failure of priority. On racial justice, the divide is equally stark. Gen Z is the most racially diverse generation in American history. 48% identify as non-white. They came of age during Black Lives Matter. They watched the videos, they attended the protests, and then they watched many predominantly white churches either remain silent or actively condemn the protests while claiming to preach justice and equality. In June 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, a survey found that 64% of white evangelicals believed that police killings of Black Americans were isolated incidents, while 72% of Black Americans believed they were part of a broader pattern. Young people in multiracial friend groups and diverse communities couldn't reconcile those drastically different perspectives with the idea of a unified church. Where's your perspective on all of this? What profession are you in, and how does that shape how you see the story? Teachers, healthcare workers, business owners, I want to hear from all of you in the comments. Economic issues matter too. Gen Z has inherited an economy where housing is unaffordable, student debt is crushing, and job security is a myth. According to the Federal Reserve, the average student loan debt for Gen Z graduates is $32,000. Home ownership rates for people under 35 are at historic lows. Many of these young people look at megachurches with multi-million-dollar buildings and wonder why their pastor drives a Bentley while they can't afford rent. They hear prosperity gospel preaching that if you're struggling financially, you lack faith. They're told to tithe while working 3 jobs. The cognitive dissonance is unbearable. A viral tweet from 2022 read, "My church built a $5 million worship center and told me I should give more to sow seeds of prosperity while I'm trying to figure out if I can afford both rent and groceries this month. That's when I was done." But perhaps the most quietly devastating issue is mental health. Gen Z has higher rates of anxiety and depression than any previous generation. According to the American Psychological Association, 91% of Gen Z adults reported experiencing at least one physical or emotional symptom related to stress. They desperately need support. What many found in their churches was judgment instead of help. Depression was a sign of weak faith. Anxiety meant you weren't praying enough. Therapy was secular and dangerous. Just read your Bible more, pray harder, have more faith. 29-year-old Emily shared her story online. "I told my small group leader I was suicidal. She told me to stop taking my medication because I just needed to trust God more." 6 months later, I almost died. The church called my suicide attempt selfish. That was the last time I walked through those doors. Stories like Emily's are horrifyingly common. The church's failure to address mental health with compassion and evidence-based support has cost them an entire generation's trust. Now, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because while Gen Z is leaving traditional churches in droves, they're not abandoning religious community entirely, they're reimagining it. All over the country, young people are forming alternative spiritual communities. House churches where everyone gets a vote on decisions. Social justice collectives that incorporate prayer and meditation. Online faith communities that are LGBTQ affirming and progressive. Interfaith groups that prioritize action over doctrine. These communities look nothing like traditional church. They meet in living rooms, coffee shops, parks. They might incorporate Christian elements alongside Buddhist meditation or Jewish rituals. Their leaders are often not ordained. Their services are unstructured. Their theology is fluid. And they're growing. A movement called The Liturgists started as a podcast in 2014 and became a thriving community of thousands of people who describe themselves as spiritually homeless. The Progressive Christianity hashtag on Instagram has over 200,000 posts. Online communities like the Deconstructionists podcast have massive followings. These communities share common values: radical inclusion, social justice, environmental activism, questioning over certainty, journey over destination. They represent not the death of faith among Gen Z, but its evolution. But here's the question that should haunt traditional church leaders. What happens when an entire generation walks away? Not just to the spiritual seekers and questioners, which every generation has, but the majority? The answer is already becoming clear. Churches are closing at an unprecedented rate. According to research by Lifeway, around 4,000 to 7,000 churches close their doors permanently each year in the United States. Meanwhile, only about 1,000 to 4,000 new churches are started annually. Do the math. That's a net loss of thousands of churches every single year. Rural churches are particularly vulnerable. Small-town congregations that once had hundreds of members now have dozens. The median age in many of these churches is over 60. When that generation is gone, many of these churches will simply cease to exist. But it's not just rural areas. Urban and suburban churches are struggling too. Mega churches that built massive facilities are finding they can't fill the seats. Denominations are merging congregations, selling buildings, laying off staff. The financial implications are staggering. American religious congregations take in about $124.5 billion in donations annually. If Gen Z continues their current trajectory, that number could drop by tens of billions of dollars over the next 20 years. The entire infrastructure of American religious life, from seminaries to missionary organizations to religious publishing houses, depends on that money. Some denominations see the crisis clearly and are trying to adapt. The Episcopal Church has embraced full LGBTQ inclusion. Many Methodist churches are splitting over similar issues, with progressive branches forming that align more closely with Gen Z values. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has taken strong stances on climate change and racial justice. But many churches, particularly in conservative evangelical and Catholic spaces, are doubling down. They're framing this exodus not as a wake-up call, but as persecution. They're telling their remaining members that Gen Z is lost, deceived by secular culture, seduced by moral relativism. They're circling the wagons instead of opening the doors. And that response, more than anything else, tells you how this story ends, because Gen Z isn't asking churches to abandon their theology. Most of the young people leaving aren't demanding that churches stop believing in God or Jesus or salvation. They're asking for something much simpler and yet apparently much harder. They're asking churches to practice what they preach. They're asking for institutions that prioritize people over politics, that value integrity over influence, that practice radical love instead of just preaching it, that protect the vulnerable instead of the powerful, that admit mistakes instead of covering them up. that listen instead of lecture, that serve instead of being served. These shouldn't be radical demands. They're literally what Jesus taught. But somewhere along the way, many American churches lost the plot. They became institutions focused on self-preservation, political power, and cultural dominance. And Gen Z sees it. They see all of it. Because they grew up in the age of information, where nothing stays hidden, where every scandal breaks on Twitter, where hypocrisy is exposed in real time. You can't tell young people that all lives matter when you're silent about police brutality. You can't tell them to care for creation while denying climate science. You can't tell them to welcome the stranger while supporting closed borders. You can't tell them that character matters while excusing the character flaws of your political allies. You can't tell them to protect children while shuffling abusive priests from parish to parish. They're watching, they're listening, and they're drawing conclusions. Now, some people will watch this video and think, I'm attacking the church. I'm not. I'm describing what's happening. These aren't my opinions. These are documented trends backed by data from Pew Research, Barna, PRRI, Gallup, and dozens of academic studies. This is reality. Some will say Gen Z is just young and naive, that they'll return to church when they're older, have kids, need community. Maybe. Every generation rebels against their parents' institutions. But here's the thing. Millennials said the same thing and they never came back. In fact, religious affiliation among millennials has continued to decline as they age. That's not how it's supposed to work. The pattern is breaking. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the church that emerges from this crisis will be smaller but healthier, more authentic, more aligned with its founding principles. Maybe losing Gen Z is the wake-up call needed for radical reform. Or maybe American Christianity as we've known it is ending. Maybe in 50 years, churches will be historical artifacts, beautiful buildings converted to museums and event spaces, reminders of a time when religion shaped American culture. Maybe faith will survive, but institutional church will not. I don't know which future we're heading toward, but I know this. The message from Gen Z is clear. They've spoken loudly, consistently, and increasingly publicly. They've said why they're leaving, what they need, what would bring them back. The question is whether anyone in power is listening. Because every Sunday, somewhere in America, a young person sits in a pew, phone in hand, and makes a decision. To stay or to go. To give the church one more chance or to walk away forever. Multiply that decision by millions, repeat it week after week, year after year, and you have the story we're living through right now. The great unraveling. The mass exodus. The brutal message from a generation that was raised to believe in something and walked away when the institution failed to live up to its own teachings. If this video challenged you, informed you, or made you think differently, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps keep this channel going and allows us to research and create more content like this. And if you're not in a position to financially support, that's totally okay. Just sharing this video, leaving a thoughtful comment, or subscribing helps more than you know. The future of American religion is being written right now, in the decisions of young people across the country. Some will stay, some will leave. Some will try to reform from within. Some will build something entirely new. But whatever happens, we're witnessing a historical shift that will reshape American culture for generations to come. And that story, brutal as it may be, is one we all need to understand.